So I wanted to open up by talking about sort of the macro issue, because we all get caught up day to day in our own little worlds. You know, we're so focused on what's going on in our office politics, whatever the newspaper put out today about, you know, what we're not doing right, you know, all of those things. But there's a much bigger issue. You know, humans came to be about 200,000 years ago. And what's interesting, this is a great article, by the way, that I just happened to read a few weeks ago by Noam Chomsky. But, you know, it was this confluence of events that allowed human beings to be created. And the Ice Age and the extinction of the dinosaurs was a big piece of it. But if you look at what we've done in the last 100 years, we have undone, really, a lot of the, basically the elements that made it possible for human beings to exist. So the irony is we're sort of destroying the environment that allows us to live, which is an oversimplification, but I think you guys understand what I'm saying. You know, we still have the power to change the direction that we're on. But fundamentally, the elephant in the room is population, right? And sprawl is obviously a big problem. But we had 2 billion people in 1900. We have 7 billion now, and we're heading towards 9 billion by 2050. So again, you don't need to be a rocket scientist or anything to figure out that that's a lot of people. And if we don't have density and we don't share more resources, you know, if we have to create a new widget for every single person, like that iPhone right there takes 20 tons of raw material. And they didn't start recycling those until just 2 years ago. So, you know, we have to change or we are going to go away. The good news is cities are coming together. This is the NACTO cities. Just a few years ago, there were like 10 of us. Now there's almost 40. I'm hoping Providence will be the next city to join and start to share information. The other great thing is people are interested in this stuff. I was just in Nashville, and they put me in like the Coliseum. Now, granted, we didn't fill the Coliseum, but this is like the last event before I was there was like midget wrestling. I mean, it's huge. So the fact that there's a general interest in urbanism and sustainability and transportation, I think, is a wonderful thing. We had a Coalition for Smarter Growth event in DC a few weeks ago, and it was pouring rain. We're like, no one's gonna come. We had 300 people come, and we actually couldn't fit any more people in the room. So people care about this stuff, and they understand the impact on their quality of life. And a lot of it is because they see the visual changes on the street. And they wanna live in cities again. There's all kinds of new technology. This is a friend of mine, Esther Dyson, Freeman Dyson's daughter, and she grew up in New York City, and I was letting her try my Elf, which is a velomobile. It's a cross between a car and a bike. So you pedal it, but it's got solar panels on the roof, and it's got a little 7-pound battery. A Tesla's got about 3,500 pounds of batteries. It goes about 90 miles on a charge, and it charges itself. So Esther said to me, she said, you know what? I'm like 50-something years old, and I've never driven a car. It's my first time. So there's all kinds of new technology. I was in Portland recently for ULI, and they're starting to switch over delivery of food to restaurants to these things. This is an electric trike with refrigeration on the back. So there's all kinds of cool stuff, much of it from the private sector, springing up. I work in Cambridge 2 days a week, and I'm sure a lot of you go to Cambridge. You know, they've raised crosswalks everywhere, like they do in Northern Europe. So if you're entering a local street, you really feel like you're a guest as an automobile driver in that area. So we're starting to prioritize active transportation again. So there's good stuff happening. I was out in Vancouver, and you know, they've gone beyond what we're doing really in this country, which is trying to reallocate some space for bikes, and they're building streets with space for bikes. And when you do that, suddenly people start to bike, because you build it and they will come. You build highways, they will drive. You build streetcars, they will take the streetcar. You build bike lanes, they will bike. My friend Leah Treat, who worked for me in DC and Chicago, is now running the Portland Department of Transportation. Now, every streetscape that they do, bioswales are a standard and rain gardens are a standard part of the streetscape. So you don't need the advanced sewer system. You need natural filtration. And look, they even put a little bench in there, so there's a place to sit. And actually, my friend Scott Kubley, who also worked for me in DC and Chicago, just took over the Seattle Department of Transportation. They're making big investments in rail. In fact, the new Amazon campus basically is a streetcar campus. The streetcar runs right through it. That's how the majority of people get to work that live in Seattle proper. And they have beautiful public spaces that they've built around these streetcar. And even alleys are being utilized, whether you're in San Francisco or Seattle. Obviously, this looks like Europe. This is actually Seattle. Alleys can be great public spaces. And when I was in Chicago, we had a public space program called the Make Way for People program. I have a couple pictures later on. And we converted alleys into these great spaces for people to sit in and have lunch. We have jazz on Friday nights, things of that nature, fashion shows. And our waterfronts that are important industrial areas, but also are important people areas. And so we're finding ways to take portions of those waterfronts. That's Vancouver above. I found the panoramic photo option on my iPhone, and I've just been going crazy with it. So I actually took these photos. In fact, that's, whoops, I think I just turned it off. That's my wife right there and baby. But this is right by the new ballpark. This is this great space that we have concerts. And up here, they've just done some amazing stuff on the Vancouver waterfront. This is the new convention center. There's a hotel here. The bike infrastructure, the pedestrian infrastructure is all integrated extremely well. And even in more rural areas, I was on Block Island this summer, which is the first time I had ever been there. What a beautiful place. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I set this thing off on my bicycle, by the way. I was on my bike. I actually was on my bike, but I don't know how that happened. But there's even a recognition outside of cities that we gotta slow down. At 40 miles an hour, if you hit somebody, there's a 95% chance that they're gonna die. When you hit them at 20, there's an 80% chance that they're gonna live. So there's a reason we have speed limits. And the difference between 20 and 40 is literally life and death. And bike-share systems. Bike-share systems went from being this sort of kitschy, interesting thing, maybe the tourists would use it. In DC, we had the first bike-share system before Capital Bikeshare called Smart Bike. We had 10 stations and 100 bikes. And for a city our size, that was pretty small. But it was a pilot program. And people, use it a little bit. But once we put in 100 stations with Arlington, Virginia, and 1,000 bikes, it became a part of the transportation landscape. Now there's 200 stations in the district, I think about 350 region-wide, and it's in 3 states. And you can start, with 20, but then you want to get to 30 and 40 and 50 and 100 and make it a primary mode of transportation. I got to work on the private sector side. I actually went to France and found these bikes. They're very cool bikes. This just launched. I think there's 50 stations launching in Seattle, sponsored by Alaska Airlines. There's a lot of different ways to fund these things. The way I found that has worked for me was to use public money to capitalize it and then use private money basically to fund the operations. But there's a million different models. In this case, a nonprofit actually runs the system. And when we think of technology, we tend to just think about apps on our phone. Technology has really hit our public way and in a positive way. So that first generation bike share system that we had in DC, it was a $70,000 2-month construction project to integrate with the power lines and put new sidewalks in concrete. This takes 45 minutes to put in. The system that you guys are going to have is even faster than this. These are solar powered, modular. Yours will be stationless, I think. I mean, it'll have stations, but you don't have to leave it at a station. So the technology is evolving so quickly. And in Chicago, we launched 300 stations, and it was $22 million, which might seem like a lot of money, but that's a drop in the bucket. Some of our bridges are $300 and $400 million just for a bridge. And that's something that people don't think about. When they think about, hey, let's build this highway or this road to nowhere or this bridge or whatever it is, nobody calculates the maintenance costs or the cost to rebuild it. one state, oh, it was Massachusetts, actually. Davies said a few times, like, we're not building any more roads. We're just not going to do it. Don't need them, can't afford it. That's smart. And government has realized that it's not just about putting something out there. You got to actually market it well. You have to actually market it like Coke would market sugar water. But we're doing something good, right? And so we actually worked with IDEO, which designed the Apple mouse, amongst many other things. They're one of the best branding firms in the country. We spent some money, because this was not a small program for us. And Chicago loved it. In fact, the front page of the paper at one point put up a big heart and said, "Chicago loves Divvy." And if you know the press in Chicago, I mean, that's a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. That's actually my wife. Don't tell her she's in here. She was pregnant at the time. But we started fun programs where we'd have like one red bike in the entire system, or one pink bike, and people would start to take pictures of it, and became this social media phenomena. And people would stop their car, park, get out of the car, and get on that one red bike, or in this case, the pink bike, because they thought it was fun. Marketing these services can be fun and whimsical and connect with the community, in this case, with the Cherry Blossom Festival. And this was going around on Twitter a couple weeks ago. People are finally realizing there's a big difference between sharing the road on a very local street where the average speed is about 12 miles an hour and an arterial street. And if you had to share your car with Amtrak, it's like sharing a car lane with your bike. So we need to treat bikes and pedestrians not only as equals, but actually we need to put them above the car. The other thing that's happening, unfortunately we lost our streetcars. And I think many of you know the history of that and the story and the collusion that happened and many other things that led to the demise of the streetcar in most cities, including Providence, and this idea that, hey, we're going to have these flexible buses. But also keep in mind that the streetcars, the problem with the streetcars was they lasted like 100 years. So there was nothing to replace. Chris Rock tells a funny joke. He says, you think Cadillac can't make a car with a bumper that doesn't fall off if you hit it going 5 miles an hour? He's like, they could, but they're not that expletive stupid. Well, it's the same thing. These streetcars were in some ways too reliable. There weren't enough rubber parts to replace. There wasn't enough money in it. So we moved to buses. But we had all this space. This is Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And so what did we do? Well, it was empty for about 45 years. And I went to the mayor and I said, hey, Earl Blumenauer, the congressman from Oregon, has been harping on me to figure out a way to put a bike lane on Pennsylvania Ave. And Earl thought that we would just, put it there and there. And I said, let's just, I'm not a planner or an engineer, but I said, why not use this space? Well, nobody's ever done that before. But we did it, and it's an incredible ride. And you have the best line of sight that you could have on a bike. You can see the entire roadway. And it's fun. And people commute on it, tourists use it, and it was wasted space before. Downtown Chicago, one of the things about bike facilities or streetcars or any of this stuff is like, it's sort of easy to say, or car sharing, I was in that business, and you say, well, let's maybe do the easy thing first. Let's put the car share car out in the suburbs. Let's put a bike lane over here in this neighborhood. The thing is, you really need to do it where there's the most pain. When we polled people in Chicago, 2/3 of people said, I would consider, well, almost 2/3, about 63%, said I'd consider riding my bike, but never downtown. It's just not safe. And so, like, we looked at Dearborn Street. We had 4 lanes, right? And we've got parking. This is a bus lane that's not enforced very well. And we had about 8,000 to 12,000 cars. And we had capacity for about 24,000 cars. So who knows what happens when you have a lot of capacity and not enough vehicles? Anybody? Yes, speeding. It's human nature. The wider the road is, the less it's going on. That's an invitation to go as fast as humanly possible. That's what we're used to doing on the highway. It's really just psychology. So, and spatial relations, I guess. So, we took one of the lanes, and if I can get this thing to work, we made it into a 2-way bike facility with its own signals. We got rid of 1 car lane. We obviously did not enforce the bus lane. It's the FedEx/bus lane. And guess what? There was no difference in throughput, really. We also added, signalized turn lanes up at the intersections. So we actually, in some ways, made the operations for the automobile more efficient, and we gave space to bikes, and we cut speeding down by about 30–40%. And that's something that people don't realize. There's this confusion in urban areas. People think that the faster you go, the faster you're going to get to your destination. There's actually almost no connection. You have stoplights and stop signs at every intersection. It doesn't matter how fast you go. It's about how organized the throughput is. It's about getting rid of double parking. It's about getting rid of speeding and conflicts. And if you look at this road, and I found a lot of this when I got to Chicago, there were no lane markings anywhere. They just stopped doing it. They just didn't have the money, and they're like, yeah, we're just not going to do that. So people on this street would speed and pass on the inside, or on the curbside. Lots of accidents. So by putting in the bike lane, what we really did, this is a safety project for automobiles. What we did is we rationalized the space and organized it and made it safer for everybody. So you have less space for a pedestrian to traverse if they need to cross the street. You have a safe cycling area. We had too much capacity for cars anyway, and we had speeding and crashes. Milwaukee Ave happens to be the busiest bike lane in the United States, and we finally gave them a quality bike lane. And we found, hey, look, when you give people their own signals, you give them a bike box that they can be in, it's amazing. They obey the law. You go from 31% of people abiding by the law to 83% overnight. But when you don't have any space, you feel like a scofflaw. You're not supposed to be in the sidewalk, and you really shouldn't be. And when you're in the street, you got people screaming at you, get out of the way. So it makes a big difference. And in Chicago, we also focused a lot on public space innovation. This project, the Bloomdale Trail, was an abandoned Canadian Pacific rail line. It had been on the books since 1998. Ram came in, my boss, and said, we're getting this done, and we're going to get it done in just a couple years. And then he handed it to me with no budget, no plan. But I like working that way. And he said, get it done. And we worked with the Park District. We worked with the Trust for Public Lands, who did an amazing job. We raised a bunch of money with Trust for Public Lands. We pieced together some federal funding, some state funding, some county funding, some local funding. And we did the conceptual design, all the outreach. We did about 500 easement purchases. We did the engineering, and we went to construction in about 14 months. And it's going to be night and day. It's actually, it's about 2/3 completed now. And they're a little behind because they had such a bad winter. But it is going to link 5 neighborhoods together. It's a $91 million project. The Chicago Riverwalk, and I'm not just showing you these to show you pretty pictures, but to show you how things can get done. This has been something people have been talking about for a long time. They had done 2 blocks in about 15 years to take the most undervalued real estate. They were serving dollar beers down there. This is on the Chicago River. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous, but nobody even knew it was there. And so there were these vendors selling dollar beers and peanuts, you know, and things of that nature. And we did a conceptual design. We didn't even tell the mayor. We stole $1 million from another project, and we did a conceptual design over the course of a year. We worked with, there's some great folks in Boston. I'll think of their, Sasaki Associates, and a number of other firms. And we sort of did this in the cover of darkness. And then what happened was we were going to DC, the head of airports, the head of the CTA, which is the transit authority, and myself to go ask Ray LaHood for help. We need help. And they had just announced the new TIFIA loan program. So the night before, people have been trying to keep me out of Ram's office, you know, the budget people. They didn't want me to show him this because they're like, if he shows him this, we're screwed. He's going to want to do it. I showed it to the mayor, and his eyes got really big, and he said, actually, that's where the dollar beers were. I did have them once or twice. And actually, he loved this. This was his favorite piece. He's really into theater and ballet, and he liked the idea of having a public art space. He went crazy for it. And the next morning, I had to have a full pitch ready for La Hood. And we applied for a TIFIA loan. The CFO in Chicago was amazing and helped me do that. And this is where we were storing our equipment for the Wacker Drive project. That's how badly utilized, and we're turning it into this with floating gardens and so on. So we applied for a TIFIA loan. At the same time, did the engineering on the project, closed the TIFIA loan in 8 months. The fastest they had ever done one was 18 months in the history of the TIFIA program. And we had a Wells Street Bridge project. We bid it, we moved the team as soon as the Wells Street Bridge project was over to the Riverwalk. And so in 18 months, we went from conceiving of the project to starting construction. And the first 4 blocks will be done right after the mayor hopefully wins re-election. So things can happen quickly if you cut through the bureaucratic BS and red tape. Not everything has to be a mega project. You know, if you look at a lot of the work that was done in New York City under my friend Jeanette Sadekhan, you know, you take a place like this, like what does this look like? This looks like a place you want to work, right? This is a workplace. Very inexpensively, probably less than $10,000 or $20,000, you can make it into a place where people want to live, work, and play. It has a completely different feeling. And you don't have to do a massive construction project. You can down the road. I mean, Times Square she did as a pilot, you know, getting rid of all the cars in Times Square. Now it's being done permanently. But it's very important to actually get things done. So you look at those bike lanes I was talking about. This is what was going on before Ram and I came in. And this is what happened after we got there. Again, no budget, no plan. But the mayor came out and said we're going to do 100 miles of next generation bike facilities in Chicago. And then we had to figure it out. And we did. In the first year, we had no money. So we did all the outreach. We figured out where the network should go. And then we cross-referenced where are we doing paving, or where are the utilities doing paving? And where can we basically do these for free because we have to restripe the roads anyway. And that's what we did. The urban street design guidelines from NACTO, I strongly advise people to check them out and to use them. The federal DOT has endorsed them. Federal Highways has endorsed them. And they've been pushing it down. So states should be very open-minded to building your streets in a new way for people instead of cars. And when I was at ULI, this along with the state of California endorsed them was really a big deal. And here's what happened, right? People realized this is good for business. I mean, that's how things change. You know, ULI looked at this and realized, like, hey, the real estate around these changes is worth a hell of a lot more than the real estate where you just have a car-centric area or you have a freeway nearby. It destroys the value of property. And now that we have enough of these facilities done, whether it be next generation public spaces, pop-up public spaces, protected bike facilities, safer ped areas, you see not only a big jump in safety, and by the way, there's a direct correlation, you also see a big jump in retail. Because nobody wants to hang out in an area that's not safe. Nobody's going to raise their kids in an area that's not safe. One of the other things we did that was very unpopular in Chicago was institute one of the largest speed camera programs in the United States, which is in the process of being rolled out. But in a city that's 221 square miles with 2.7 million people in a region of 9.3 million people, you got to use technology to make change. And so we did. We're also putting money into re-upping, if you will, our infrastructure. We had old CTA stations, some of them over 100 years old. We also had places like this down by McCormick Place, which is where all the conventions are, also adjacent to an up-and-coming neighborhood that weren't going to grow if we didn't build a CTA station. And people were driving from the airport. So now they can train directly to the convention center. This is in the West Loop, which was recently named one of the hottest neighborhoods in America. It was an industrial area. It was also an area where people made sausage and cheese and things of that nature. We want to preserve that, but we also want to stimulate mixed-use development. We put in this new station, very modern, juxtaposed against this industrial area. A few weeks later, after we completed it, Google announced 300,000 square feet, 2 blocks north. A hotel was announced. Transit investments, particularly rail investments, stimulate other economic investment in your community. The irony of the streetcar, because, well, I'll actually talk about the streetcar separately in just a minute. Again, talking about safety, you look at some of the most successful areas of the country, they also are some of the safest, and Rhode Island is right there. DC, by the way, which is number 1, more of an urban context, but has seen an 83% decline in all traffic fatalities over 10 years. So we had a Vision Zero when nobody knew what Vision Zero was, and we are heading towards zero. And we also have one of the strongest automated enforcement systems in the country that even dings people for running stop signs. So if you run a stop sign in DC, chances are you're going to get a ticket from a camera. But I'd much rather have that than be distracted by my phone and run over a child, So automated enforcement works. And Rhode Island has not seen as much of a drop as some other places. So that's something probably to work on. So why now? And I don't know how I'm doing on time. I assume I'm doing okay. But if I'm running over, please let me know, somebody. So this is, we just had our big conference for NACTO in San Francisco, but this is by far the most exciting time in transportation since, let's say, 1890 to 1910. The Industrial Revolution changed transportation permanently. And the cloud revolution, or the internet revolution, is now changing it again. This is actually on Block Island. I thought this was fun. We had a VW thing when I was a kid, and these folks were having so much fun laughing at each other's cars. But really, old is meeting new. Things that worked before are coming back into vogue. For instance, the electric car. I love this slide. There were, I think, 800 electric taxi cabs in New York City in the early 1900s. Mysteriously, the warehouse that stored them burned to the ground, and all of them went away. But guess why people like these? Oh, by the way, they went 25 miles on a charge, just like the ones that we had around the turn of this century. They had charging stations, battery swap stations, and guess why people liked them? They were zero emissions compared to the horses. That was a big deal. You had horse and buggy everywhere, so you had horse manure everywhere on the streets. People like these as an alternative. So it's just a different emission that we're dealing with now. But electric cars are not new. Actually, Elon Musk came out a few weeks ago and said, actually, we're going to have a lot of those features in 2015 instead of 2017. That's how fast technology is changing. When people think about a technology, they think about it in sort of this linear fashion. It's more like this. For every change, you get that much more exponential change. And so my iPhone can do a better EKG than some of the equipment in the hospital now. Our economy will be completely changed over the next couple decades. We may not have doctors in the way that we have doctors today, or lawyers, and many, many other things that we take for granted. But this all happened before. Look at the tension between the modes in 1928. That horse is getting ready to run right into the streetcar. And you have cars. So you have cars, horse and buggy, and streetcars. And in fact, I know on Pennsylvania Avenue in DC, because I just researched this, in the late 1800s, there was serious competition between the horse and buggy and the electric streetcar to get people up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. And the cab drivers were basically the horse and buggy drivers. So now you have the taxi driver versus the Uber driver, and so on and so forth. And then, what's the last mile? Everybody's trying to figure it out. How are people going to get from the Amtrak station to their work, or from the CTA station? I'd like to think it's the bike, but who knows? It could be an electric pod vehicle. I think we're missing a picture here. Anyway, there's a nice picture of my new company, Bridge, which is, it's a new pop-up mass transit service, basically trying to redesign bus service to be flexible. So that, think of it like a cross between a taxi or Uber and the bus. To demand aggregate people to walk 5 minutes, spend $5, and walk 5 minutes on the other end. with basically no origin, destination, and floating stops. So that's where we think bus service is going to go over time. And there's things like Liftline, which is really enabled, tech-enabled carpooling. So it's Lyft and Uber, but using like a paratransit algorithm to get more people in the vehicle. And I've used it, and it actually does work. Now, you're going to have people that, you know, try to scare you and say, oh, this innovation is going to kill this is going to kill that. I mean, look, some of that's going to happen, but I wanted to open up talking about the huge macro changes we're going to face in our cities and population centers and the migrations that we're going to face, because I think what's going to happen is cities will be paying companies like mine to bring their service because they aren't going to be able to deal with the influx of people. Now, that's a wonderful thing in some ways because cities need more tax base. But if you aren't ready with transportation options for people, they aren't going to be able to live there necessarily. So we're going to have to ramp up quickly. And a lot of these private sector, more flexible options are going to be key to our cities of the future. I think the cities are always going to operate the core of the transportation system. You know, the bus rapid transit, the streetcar, the arterial bus network, but maybe not the stuff that they're not so good at. And you're also going to have people try to scare you, particularly some of the car companies, that autonomous cars aren't good, right? This is a bad thing. It's not proven. I tell you what's not proven is allowing millions of people to drive around all day, drunk, texting. That doesn't work. We will look back on this era and be like, can you believe they used to let people drive down in the city? Can you believe that? And when you go to the Netherlands, for instance, most of the downtown cores, you can't drive. If you go to Deventer, which is a great little place, you can't even bike. They consider biking too unsafe in the pedestrian area. They have a lot of older people, a lot of young people. There's no biking in the core, only walking. You get outside of that immediate core, you can bike and walk. You get outside of that, you're in farmland. You can do anything you want. And they have very nice bike lanes in farmland, by the way. So, part 3, you know, we realize we've made some horrible mistakes. I think most people understand that now. So how do we get where we need to go? For one thing, the actual DOT has to change, or the government has to change. I can tell you in Chicago, Ram and I never talked about transportation, really. You can go look at the press conferences we have. You know, we talked about the benefits to people. We talked about the outcomes. We talked about enhancing people's health. For the mayor, it was all about jobs. Like bike lanes were all about jobs. Bike lane equaled jobs. He wanted people, we had 61 colleges and universities in Chicago, in the city. And a lot of those people would graduate and move to the coast. And he wanted to create an environment that made young people want to stay in the city. And let me tell you something, bike lanes, streetcars, pop-up cafes, that kind of stuff creates place, and that's what people want. So we created an agenda with about 120 metrics that we committed to hit over 2 years, and we did the same thing in DC. But we backed it up also with long-term plans. We had a pedestrian plan, a cycling plan, a complete streets plan, and a sustainability plan that fed into our 2-year plan. We also made bold statements and pronouncements that we are going to prioritize other things. Because a lot of times politically, people don't want to say that. They just want to not say it, and maybe we're going to work on the pedestrian stuff, but it's okay if most people think we're going to prioritize the car. We publicly went out and said we are not prioritizing the car anymore. The pedestrian is the indicator species of a healthy city, not the automobile. And so we're going to redesign around people instead of a particular mode of transportation. And I understand you guys have your first parklet here in Providence. We have ones that were $1,000, and then we have ones like this that were $70,000 that are modular. You can take them apart. This is won National Design Awards. Here's a less expensive one. It's basically just decking and planters. But here's the interesting thing. ULI did a study, talked to private sector and public sector people. What we're investing in is the inverse of what we need to invest in. We have great healthcare facilities. We keep spending more and more money on that. We're not investing in the things that make our cities places where people want to live. We're bootstrapping it, but we need to spend a lot more if we want to be like Amsterdam or Tokyo or other places. So the streetcar, in a lot of places, very controversial. And I'll tell you why it's controversial, because almost nobody remembers how great the cities were with the streetcar. I've met people in DC who are in their 80s who used to ride the streetcar, and they said, when they closed the streetcar, all my neighbors left. They all moved out of the city. It was a trend. I mean, it wasn't just the streetcar. It was, post-war. Everybody thought, oh, I can get a white picket fence. It was the American dream. But these folks used to take a streetcar down and do all the shopping. They didn't have any cars. And they felt that when the streetcar was ripped out, people felt abandoned. And when you go to Wikipedia, look at the demographic trends, because for every city, it shows you when the population went up and down. There's almost always a direct correlation. Within 5 years of the streetcar being taken out, the population dropped dramatically. Here's Providence, and I forget the street. It starts with a W. Westminster. Look at all the people on Westminster. Streetcar tracks. There's a streetcar actually up there. There's the horse and buggy. I mean, this is the epitome of an active street. It's beautiful. That was, by the way, 1903. This is 1910. Now you see the streetcar over there in the town square, but you see the car culture started to take over. So in 1900, we had 8,000 cars in the United States. By 1930, we had 28 million of these pods running around. When people think about streetcars, they think of one thing. They think of the Portland streetcar, which I love. But when you go to Europe, you'll see, or Asia, you can run a streetcar absolutely anywhere. You can run it in a greenway, through a park, down a street. You can give it its own right-of-way. It's actually very versatile. I worked very hard on the DC streetcar. It's actually up and running now. It's not in revenue service yet. It will be in about a month. When we put this in, when we announced it and started going to construction, every single parcel of real estate was bought up on the entire corridor. The highlight of this corridor at the time was Murray's Steaks. If you've lived down south, you know Murray's Steaks is a very low-quality grocery store. We have a $1.6 billion design, build, operate, maintain contract on the street to build somewhere between 8 miles and 37 miles. They're still figuring out because it's controversial. Some people don't want to fund it. Some people want to fund it. Do you know who wants the streetcar more than anybody? The developers. They've already seen huge, huge profits on H Street. And so they're the ones that are pushing it. You can do bus rapid transit as well. It's a different purpose. Bus rapid transit, its purpose is to move people faster. The streetcar's purpose is to move people and create place. It's a very different focus. But you can accomplish some great things in downtown Chicago. We are remaking the streets into complete streets with bus rapid transit. Autonomous vehicles are going to change the way people move outside of cities in particular. And I think they will approximate transit more in convoys. And the beauty of autonomous cars is really not just that it's going to be safer and people can, sit on their iPhones and do work while they're driving. But it's getting rid of all the parking. We're going to need 85% less parking. So think of how different your streets would be if we could get rid of 85% of the parking. And the public's way ahead of most of us in government. Many of them trust vehicles that are driverless with their children more than driving with themselves. And parking garages, think of the value pent up in parking garages. We ate at a great pizza place last night. Steve, what was it called? Figadidi's. Awesome. I was like, I couldn't remember. That was a parking space converted into a pizza restaurant. Much higher and better use. And now people all over the place are looking at, should we use parking spaces as hotel rooms at night until we can get rid of them completely? Micro units, you guys have micro units going in. Modular and flexible is the name of the game. And that's what people are designing. And guess what? The poverty that we saw in the cities, post-streetcar removal, post-riots, is now moving to the suburbs. Doesn't have to, though. In Arlington, Virginia, they're urbanizing. So the suburbs need to become cities. And when the suburbs become cities, then they will be successful. Arlington, Virginia has more office space now than Denver or Dallas. And they've cut their congestion in the city by 15 to 30% on every major arterial. I'm almost done, Brett. Like 3 more slides. And the young people, the next generation, they want to live in places like Providence with a streetcar and bike lanes and public cafe space. They don't care about owning a car or a house. They just don't care. They want the experience of life. And I would just encourage everybody, particularly those in government, to embrace some of the new business models that are coming along. And if government embraces it versus fighting it, you can shape the change, whether it's autonomous vehicles or ride sharing or anything else. And by the way, thank God for Amtrak. We cannot get rid of Amtrak. That's the only thing we have right now that connects our regions, but we do need to invest in high-speed rail over time like they have in Asia and Europe. This is my last slide. This is my new daughter and my new bike. It's actually her new bike, but people tell me I'm lying. It's really my new bike. But at the end of the day, it's all about people. And the reason that I've been doing this work over the last 10 years is for all of my friends and my friends' kids and all the people like yourselves. And now that I have a daughter, finally, I waited as long as humanly possible. You know, I'm doing it for her. And I think that as a people, as a government, as cities, we're only as good as the service that we're providing for the smallest people and the oldest people and the most disabled people and the poorest people. And if we design our cities for those people, everybody else will be fine. Thank you so much for listening.